All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started here. I know we only have about 24 attendees of the 70 plus who registered, but I do know that a lot of people are planning on just watching the recording anyway because they're busy right now. So thank you, those of you who are able to make it in today, especially those of you that went into the office today. I know that big snowstorm's coming through Seattle right now. So this is going to be our first installment in the CompWise safety webinar series. Today we're going to talk about slips, trips, and falls. I'm going to start out with some statistics for you and then get into actually the causes of those and how to prevent those from occurring. My name's John.Valentine. I'm with the CompWise Loss Prevention Department, and I am a safety and risk consultant. A little bit about myself, originally from Pennsylvania, now work both domestically and internationally with clients in 40 states and 5 countries so far under various regulatory bodies. My background, I started out as an intern with Zachary Engineering. Then I finished up my master's coursework in industrial hygiene at WVU. Went on from there to work for Marathon Petroleum in various refineries, their marine transport facility, and their corporate office. Also led a shutdown turnaround project with them. After that, I spent about a year as a health and safety coordinator on a small pipeline construction project out in Southwest PA that was about 11 miles long and had 250 employees at its peak. And now I am a safety and risk management consultant with York Risk Services, who is the parent company of the CompWise program in Washington, as well as CareWorks. And then I also am contracted with MSA, the safety company, as a global fall protection, confined space, and rescue trainer. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with the material here. I want to start off with a couple definitions. So how exactly do we define a slip? That is going to be when there's too little friction or traction between your footwear and the walking working surface that you're on, and then that results in a loss of balance, which leads to ultimately a fall, which ends up being the cause of a lot of injuries in the workplace. A trip is a little bit different. So instead of not having enough friction with a trip, you're going to hit an object or some sort of obstruction in the walkway, and then your upper body continues moving, and that ends up resulting in a loss of balance. All right, or you could trip by stepping down to a lower surface and losing your balance. I also want to put a little asterisk in there. You can do that actually as you're going up a surface too. As a kid, I was notorious for falling while going upstairs just because I went a little too quickly. So trips can also be falls that are while you're on a staircase as well, or stepping from a curb down to off the curb. Couple more definitions. The fall actually occurs when the body's too far off its center of balance, either due typically to a slip or trip. And then there's 2 types of falls that we register. There are falls at the same level, which would be your slips and trips. And then there are falls to lower levels, which is when you're working on a ladder or you're up on a raised platform or a roof, and then you fall down to a lower level or working surface. Slips and falls are the leading cause of workers' compensation claims, or a leading cause of workers' compensation claims for people aged 15 to 24 years old. A lot of times these workers are less susceptible to overexertions, though they can have overexertions. But younger folks, the leading cause for occupational injury for them is slips and falls. And they are the primary cause of lost days from work as well. And that information is from the National Floor Safety Institute. Slips, trips, and falls accounted for 26% of the total occupational injuries and illnesses in the United States in 2016. That was the last large survey that they put out data for so far, and makes them one of the leading causes of occupational injuries and illnesses in the entire country. Slips, trips, and falls are linked to 22% of all accidental deaths, which is the second leading cause behind motor vehicles, and that is both in and outside of the workplace, those numbers here. These numbers come from the CDC. In 2016, there were 33,381 deaths due to falls. And they're one of the most frequently reported injuries and make up about 25% of total reported claims per year in the country. and over 17% of all disabling injuries result in or are a result of falls. And with falls and slips and trips, they are completely preventable in most cases. And later on in this presentation, we're going to talk about that prevention. As far as just in the workplace in 2016, 849 fatalities, which was 17% of all those fatalities. 229,000 cases with days away from work. So imagine the amount of money spent in lost time payments just due to slips, trips, and falls. 33% of slip fall incidents resulted in more than 31 days away from work, which is why we see such high claim values with falls. And then just in Washington, just looking at our group programs here in Washington, I pulled some of the numbers for those. And retail wholesale services, this is a 2-year period for you guys. So from October of 2016 to July of 2018, we saw 636 claims just in that Association of Washington Business, Retail, and Wholesale Services retro group. That made up 31% of the total claims and incurred costs of over $12 million with an average cost of $20,000 per claim and almost 12,000 time lost days. That's just in a 2-year period, and that is just in the retail wholesale services group that AWB runs in Washington. Hospitality group, I know we have some folks from every group in this webinar. Hospitality group, I have a 4-year period available for you because you were one of the first groups that we started working with up here. You guys had 287 claims that were related to falls, which was 14% of your total claims and resulted in almost $5 million in damages at an average value of almost $17,000 a claim and 7,600 total lost days. In the facilities and property management group, so we're looking at almost a 2-year period here for you as well. So from October 6th of 2016 to July of 2018, we saw 149 claims, which was 17% of your total. $3.9 million in incurred costs due to those injuries at an average cost of $26,000 per claim and 4,100 time lost days. So in total of all those groups that we're managing here, we saw 1,072 slip, trip, fall claims, which was 23% of claims overall in those groups, and $21 million in costs at an average cost of almost $20,000 per claim and a total of almost 24,000 time lost days. So slips and falls, which are extremely preventable, are your number 3 most frequent claim and the number 2 most expensive claim. For those of you wondering what number 1 is across all the groups, it is overexertion. So your lifting injuries, your back injuries related to lifting. And we are actually going to have a webinar later on this year on preventing those back injuries and overexertion injuries. So we will also be tackling that topic later on. And again, these numbers are for very short periods, so 2 years for 2 of those groups and 4 years for the hospitality group, and that is only in Washington, only in those groups that the AWB runs. So we see a lot of dollar value gets lost here, which results in higher premiums and lower refunds. So what would a 10% reduction in slip, trip, falls really end up providing in savings? If we would just across the boards reduce these numbers by 10%, we would see in total $2.1 million in savings across all these groups, and about 107 less claims total. So that's why we decided to put on this webinar in this particular topic, is because we definitely see this as one of the easiest injuries that is very common and very costly to start preventing. Your typical slip, trip, and fall injuries, the body parts that they affect are typically the knee, ankle, and foot, and that is usually due to rolling a knee or an ankle while you're falling. Also wrists and elbows when folks are trying to catch themselves. We do see some back injuries. That's usually more associated with a fall from heights. Shoulder injuries, again, trying to catch yourself while you're falling and end up injuring your shoulder. We see a lot of hip injuries as well, and head injuries, which are the most serious injury associated with these slip, trips, and falls. A lot of people don't really think about just walking around on a surface as a hazard, but just simply tripping over a curb or an extension cord can result in a fatality. If any of you are familiar with Dr. Atkins, who pioneered the Atkins diet a few decades ago, that was actually his cause of death. Was he tripped on a curb, fell and hit his head, and that resulted in a fatality. You may be more familiar with Alex Trebek. Alex Trebek last winter, he slipped, I believe it was on some ice, also fell and hit his head, and he was out of work for 3 months due to that injury, same injury that Dr. Atkins incurred when he fell and hit his head. Luckily, Mr. Trebek did survive that injury, though he was out of work for some time. The typical injuries we end up seeing then are sprains and strains, bruises and contusions in a best case scenario. Fractures are extremely common, especially in the arm. Abrasions and cuts, concussions and head trauma, which of course are going to be your most serious incidents. And then also with the back injuries, they're typically sprains and strains, though you can also see some skeletal injuries in a fall as well with the back. The common causes of these slips and trips, the surface composition of the floor. So do you have a really smooth or a really smooth floor? Do you have wet, oily surfaces on that floor? Or is your floor typically dry and have a rough surface that provides good traction? So how much slip resistance does the floor have when it's dry and properly cleaned? And also some hard floor surfaces may be slip resistant when dry, but then the moment you get it wet, it becomes extremely slippery. Some floor surfaces also get very slippery just when they get dust on them. So keep that in mind, the composition of your floors and the areas that you're working in. Any foreign substances, so ice, grease, and water, are major contributors to hazardous floors, and conventional mopping with the dirty mop water just makes the problem worse. So consider some sort of no-touch cleaning system or a mop bucket that has separate compartments for clean and dirty water, because a lot of times the dirty water, especially if you're cleaning up a greasy area, once you start mixing that together with the grease and then you start spreading it around, a lot of times that just makes things worse. So if you have a mop bucket that separates the dirty water from the clean water, that usually helps reduce things as well. Especially those of you in the fast food industry that are working with those greasy floors a lot. Surface conditions, so do you have any raised or recessed edges, loose carpeting, mats that are rolled over in front of your entryways at the doors? Soiling and overall cleanliness of the floor can all be factors that increase slips. And then surface changes. For example, when you're walking from a carpeted floor to a tile floor can cause someone to trip as well, especially if they can't really see the change. Or if you have a change in the level of your surface where you're stepping down onto another surface. There are a lot of restaurants that I've been to where you go into the restroom and you have to step up to get into the restroom. And then on the way back out, you're going into kind of a poorly lit area. There's a step down and you forget about it and you don't see it. It's not very apparent. And you step down and you end up tripping or falling forwards into the wall in front of you. All right. Some more common causes, obstructions, especially extension cords and hoses, or even wet floor signs can make for an unsafe obstacle course. You got to realize, especially with your customers in some locations, if you have customers that come into your workplace, putting up a wet floor sign nowadays actually creates an additional hazard compared to just making sure that floor is dried right away. How many times do you see people walking around not even looking up because their face is in their cell phone? This should not be a problem with employees because they shouldn't be on their phones, especially when they're walking around. But you can't really police that with customers. And they'll walk in with their face in their phone and walk right into a wet floor sign, and that'll cause them to trip. And next thing you know, you have a civil suit on your hands. I am guilty of this. I remember when I was a sophomore in college, walking down Prospect Street in Morgantown, West Virginia, playing Words with Friends on my phone. I ran face first into a telephone pole. Ever since then, I keep my phone in my pocket when I'm walking around, and if I need to use my phone, I stop and use it. because I did that in front of a couple people and was embarrassed for quite a while. So again, watch out for creating additional hazards by putting wet floor signs down. Extension cords. If you're running extension cords, especially if you're running them for more than just a really short time period, you should be taping those down or putting something over top of them to make them less of a trip hazard. Visibility, I mentioned poor lighting a little bit ago. Also, glares and shadows or lights that are too bright and color contrast can all impede visibility. So you want to make sure that the floor surface you're working on is or walking on is easy to see, and that you can see changes in levels and surfaces. There's a lot of human factors involved with these as well, including different physical abilities, the types of shoes that folks are wearing, and their familiarity with an area. To reduce that human factor, you can provide a shoe with better tread. But other than that, you can't really make someone's balance better, other than by adding handrails in your stairs and areas like that. But keep that in mind, especially elderly employees. They may have more trouble balancing, so a small change in level or a change in floor surface from carpet to tile could really have more of an effect on those employees who have poor balance. Falls from stairs are typically your most serious injuries. Again, you can have a fatality in a same level fall even when stairs are not involved, but the stairs tend to be the most serious injuries, and they tend to also have some more frequency. When I was working in the refineries with Marathon, we had more injuries in the corporate office than we did in the refineries. That was simply because people in the refineries were much more aware and much more highly trained. They weren't allowed to have cell phones. They knew that they could not walk up and down stairs carrying things, that they had to bring them up with a tagline or something else. Whereas in an office setting, people are often not trained as well on anything safety related. And one of the leading causes of incidents we had were office personnel carrying boxes of files downstairs instead of taking the elevator. If you're going to use both hands to carry something, you need to take the elevator. You should not be taking a staircase. And then add on top of that the shoes that are worn in an office setting. You see a lot more high heels in office setting. And those are obviously going to be harder to balance on. Platform shoes, wedges, all of those are harder to balance on than your standard tennis shoe. Unusual features, anything that could distract a walker, such as loud noises, strobe lights, or flashing lights, could also cause a slip, trip, and fall. These are less common, and I see these more in construction sites than anywhere. You have a strobe from a piece of equipment that's going by that has someone rubbernecking or turning their head to look that direction and not look at where they're walking. But typically that's on the lower end of common causes. Some general requirements, regulatory requirements for housekeeping. You need to have an effective process to clean up spills immediately that's relevant to your workplace. An effective process to mitigate leaks or other causes of slippery floors or walkways. I was actually just at the Phoenix airport yesterday, and after I landed, when I was walking through the terminal, there was it was raining out, which is rare in Phoenix, so they must not have known that their roof was not done very well on this brand new terminal, and they had a huge leak coming in that they pushed garbage cans and giant totes for moving garbage around under these leaks, and they were actually filling up and overflowing, because when it does rain in Phoenix, it rains hard. And they just had it was all over the carpeting, it was spilling out onto the tiled area, and they just could not keep up with it. So make sure you have an effective process to mitigate those leaks or other causes of slippery floors or walkways. Construction areas, aisles, stairs, ramps, runways, corridors, office shops, and storage areas where work is in progress do need to be well lit. That is actually the exact wording from the WAC standard that housekeeping is located in. So make sure your lighting's good. That tends to be more of a problem in restaurants and construction sites than it does in most other general industry settings. Make sure the floor is free of debris. You see this picture I have up here. That is a picture from obviously a fast food restaurant, one that I actually used to work at. And this is a common occurrence. You get into the busy part of the day, you start dropping some products on the floor and they get left there. It's always good to kind of have one person that's assigned to be cleaning that stuff up as it happens, and staying ahead of it, because there is nothing more slippery than a French fry on one of those floors once you step on it and kind of the grease comes out of it and gets on the floor. Even if you have a slip-resistant shoe, that French fry is going to wipe you out. Aisles, passageways, and travel lanes. Make sure you keep a clear area and move any obstructions that could create a hazard. This is a perfect example of an extension cord that's in the way and could create a trip hazard. Make sure that in general industry settings that you're marking permanent aisles and passageways that are made for pedestrians to move around, especially those of you in warehouses and really industrial settings. Your aisles need to be wide enough so that any mechanically handling equipment that you're using can pass through it. Otherwise, if you have pallet jacks and things like that that are used to move heavy objects, if you have an area that's not wide enough for those to get into, employees can't use it, and then they're going to end up going in there, tripping over things, and you're going to have your overexertion injuries because they're not able to get in there with the mechanical handling equipment, so they're going to try to lift it on their own. When you try to lift something that's too heavy, it could throw you off balance. You could fall. If you're getting it off a shelf, it could fall onto you, as well as, like I said, the overexertion injuries that could come along with that. Making sure that you maintain 3 points of contact is also very important anytime you're climbing onto equipment or climbing a ladder. Okay, that 3 points of contact, I can't tell you how many times people will know that they need to have 3 points of contact, but it's such a mental task to actually do that when you're climbing a ladder. Next time you're on a ladder, try and catch yourself. I bet you'll notice that when you go to lift one hand up to grab the next rung, if I lift my right hand up, my left leg comes off the ladder rung at the same time, and you try to climb with both appendages on one side of your body coming off the ladder at the same time. It really takes a mental discipline to get used to kind of moving more like an inchworm, where you move your right hand, then your left hand up, and then you do right foot and left foot one at a time. Always use handrails when you're using stairs as well. This is something that anytime I go to a general industry facility that has staircases, it's a write-up almost everywhere I go. I see someone not using the handrail. I know that at home you may not use it, but in the workplace you need to make sure your employees are using that, because it takes one fall down a staircase could quickly turn into a $100,000 plus claim due to all kinds of injuries that could be incurred. And then also, when you're on those ladders, a lot of people are used to the old saying to keep your belt buckle between the rails of the ladder. That's not very effective. The moment you lean your center of gravity, which is your chest, outside of those rails, the rest of your body is going to start following it. So make sure you're keeping your chest and your belt buckle between the rails on the ladder, not just that belt buckle. And that includes while you're working on the ladder. Okay. Oops, looks like that one wants to flash everything back at me again. There we go. So while you're on ladders, ladder injuries and deaths are very common across all sectors, and most of the time the incident is due to user error, not a defective ladder. Most employers are very, very good at making sure they take out defective ladders, which is great, and that is one reason that human error is a more common cause of those injuries than the defective ladders are. This first picture on the left side of your screen here, make sure you're using a ladder whenever a ladder is needed. I'm actually kind of impressed that that guy was able to get up on top of 3 buckets, but you should definitely not be doing that. It'd be really easy to lose your balance and fall off of that. The second image there, you can see a defective ladder rung, which, like I said, is not a common cause of injuries, because most of the time those ladders are taken out of service the moment they're damaged. And then the last photo there, that is a perfect example of how people end up losing their balance and falling off the ladder. Even if he still had both feet on that ladder, with his chest outside of the rails, he's already off balance and could easily fall off that ladder. Work platforms are always much safer than ladders. When you're able to use a work platform instead of a ladder, please do it. Ladders should really be a last resort. They're one of the most dangerous tools that people have on a job site, and a lot of people just don't give ladders the respect that they need because of the hazard that they pose. Users on a ladder need to be trained how to properly use a ladder. This is a huge shortcoming in the retail industry, especially. A lot of times in the retail industry, we see folks that are going out to hang up seasonal decorations in a department store or something like that. And when they're hanging up those decorations or signs or even changing a light bulb, a lot of times it's a young employee who has not been trained to actually use the ladder. It's just assumed that they know how to use a ladder. Never, ever assume or even believe someone when you ask them if they know how to use a ladder. Because if they tell you yes, it probably just means they know how to open it up. It doesn't mean that they know to use 3 points of contact to keep their chest between the rails and everything else that I've talked about so far. Also, they should have someone holding the bottom of that ladder in the retail industry to make sure they're not falling, because when you fall in the retail industry, you're not even falling onto the floor most of the time. A lot of times you're falling onto a shelf full of products and then to the floor, which could pose even more of a hazard. There is a great video if you to use for training purposes for this. It's made by either Prevent It Canada or WorkSafe BC, one of the two. But it's open source, available on YouTube. This designed specifically for the retail industry, but I use it when I teach fall protection classes in every industry. It's a great video. 3 points of contact while ascending and descending, like I said before, center of gravity between the rails, and do not hop or scoot ladders. It's very tempting to do, but get back down off the ladder and move the ladder over to where you need to work. Make sure that if you're using an extension ladder, that the first person that's on the ladder, it should be being held by someone else while they climb it, and then once they get up to where they're going to be working or something like that, they need to make sure they tie that ladder off, secure that ladder to whatever surface it's leaned against. Stairway treads and walkways need to be free of any dangerous objects, debris, and material. Slippery conditions on stairways and walkways need to be corrected immediately. That's an extremely common cause of your slip, trip, fall incidents. A lot of them are ice, especially up in Washington. It gets cold here, so we need to make sure that any ice that we have is being mitigated. Treads need to cover the entire step and landing. Again, these are right from the Washington codes for stairways. Stairways having 4 or more risers need to have railings on the open sides of all exposed stairways and stair platforms, and handrails on at least one side of closed stairways. Preferably, those should be on the right side of the body when you're descending. And it's never a bad idea to have a handrail on both sides either. If you want more information on the requirements for stairways, those are in WAC code 296-800-250. If you just Google WAC and then those numbers, it'll pop right up in a Google search. Also, those are all located on L&I's website. Fall protection. Fall protection I teach globally at a high level. Each year, falls consistently make the top 3 causes for workplace fatalities. A number of factors are often involved in falls, including unstable work surfaces, misuse or failure to use fall protection equipment, and human error. And almost every time there is human error involved. Guardrails, fall arrest systems, safety nets, hole covers, and restraint systems are all things that can prevent many of these deaths and injuries from falls. Consider using aerial lifts or elevated work platforms to provide a safer elevated working surface. Also, common names a baker scaffold or a rolling platform that has casters that lock on it. Those are highly preferable to using a ladder, especially ones that have guardrails on them if you're using the rolling scaffold. Make sure that any guardrail systems you're erecting that you put toe boards on it. Anytime you have warning lines on a roof or restraint line systems near the edges of floors and roofs. With the warning line systems, those can only be used by general industry if you're doing temporary work on a roof. And how far those warning lines have to be from the edge depend on the type of work you're doing. If you're doing an actual roof repair, they need to only be 6 feet away, but anything else in general industry, say you're going up to do maintenance on a AC unit, those warning lines then have to be at least 15 feet away from the edge. A warning line, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, is not a standard guardrail. So a guardrail has to hold 200 pounds in the outward and downward direction and needs to be 42 inches plus or minus 3 off the ground, as well as having a mid-rail. With the warning lines, those are typically just a flagged set of rope that's just there to warn folks of an edge hazard and won't actually stop them from going through it. If you need more information on that, feel free to send me an email and I can get you more information on warning line systems. Again, those are only for maintenance type work, and you have to be a good distance away from the edge to use warning lines. Make sure any floor holes you have are covered. One of the biggest oversights on this is if you have any skylights on your roof and you're going to have anyone working on the roof, whether that's a maintenance worker going up to do work on an AC unit, or you have roofers up there replacing your roof, every single one of those skylights needs to be either guardrailed, protected with a cage over top that people can't fall through, or otherwise covered up with something that can't be fallen through when someone's working up there. OSHA, WISHA, LNI, they all consider skylights to actually be an unprotected hole in a roof because skylights can be, if you back onto them or step on them, you're going to fall right through a skylight. Make sure that when you are working at heights without a guardrail that you're using a personal fall arrest system like a body harness with a lanyard or a personal fall limiter or a SRL, common name yo-yos for those, that will lock you off in the event of a fall and will keep you from hitting the ground. The most common mistake I see with fall arrest systems is folks are not using one that's going to keep their employees from hitting the ground. If you're using a standard lanyard, standard lanyards need fall clearance of 18 feet. That means from your anchorage point, the surface you're going to fall onto needs to be at least 18 feet away from you, which in most general industry settings is not the case, especially when you're using scissor lifts or boom lifts. Speaking of scissor lifts and boom lifts, aerial lifts have some unique requirements. When I say aerial lift, I'm talking about extensible booms, articulating booms, and vehicle mounted booms. I am not talking about scissor lifts right now in this next slide. Aerial lifts do require fall protection. Anytime you have one of these lifts that you see here in these images, an articulating boom, extensible boom, or vehicle mounted boom, the correct place to attach is going to be the manufacturer's designated attachment point. You cannot attach outside that basket. I don't know of any manufacturer that allows you to attach to something outside the basket and remain in the basket to do work. Basket guardrails, you cannot tie off to a guardrail. The reason is those guardrails are only designed to hold 200 pounds, and they're not designed to hold 5,000 pounds, which is what OSHA and WISHA require for you to tie off to, is a 5,000 pound anchorage point. Connector options hierarchy, this is where I mentioned that regular lanyards do not work in most situations because you need at least 18 feet of clearance from your anchorage point with a regular lanyard. Your best option is a PFL. PFLs, also known as personal fall limiters, are small devices that act like a seat belt. When you start to fall, they lock off just like a seat belt would, and they also have an energy absorber inside so that if you build up too much force, it will reduce it to a level that your body can handle without being significantly injured. Your second best option is a restraint lanyard. Again, with these boom lifts, you are at risk of being catapulted out. So a regular lanyard, which is kind of the last resort for use in these, a regular lanyard, you are going to start to fly up into the air. It will start to partially deploy on the way up. You're going to go over the guardrails and come back down on the outside. And when that's fully deployed, you're going to have 6 feet of the original lanyard length plus 4 feet of shock absorber brings you to 10 feet, plus approximately 6 feet for the worker's height brings you to 16 feet of distance now. In most aerial lifts, when you fall out of them, it's when you are driving them and you hit a bump and it catapults you out. So usually you have that at a low level while you're moving as well. And so when you get catapulted out, you're going to be touching the ground at this point. And if you're not touching the ground with that energy absorbing lanyard with that much distance deployed, when you come back down on the downswing, you're going to swing back and be almost at head level with the bottom of that lift platform, which could result in head injuries or, more commonly, decapitation, internal decapitation, where it will break your neck. And we do see fatalities due to that. When you're using a PFL, on the next slide, I'll explain the benefits of that and kind of go through the math with you. General prohibitions: you never move large distances with the basket elevated, and you never stand on the guardrails of these baskets like you see in this second picture here. You see someone standing on the guardrails. That first picture is the designated manufacturer's attachment point on that particular lift, which the manufacturer rates for at least 3,600 pounds, since it's designed by an engineer. If engineers don't design an anchorage point, then it has to hold at least 5,000 pounds. And that's just to add an additional safety factor since you're eyeballing it as a competent person. Okay. The mistakes people make in an aerial lift: I mentioned a typical lanyard requires 8+ feet of fall clearance. With a PFL, a personal fall limiter, they're round devices that essentially act like a seat belt. A Class A PFL is going to lock off and fully deploy in under 24 inches, and then we add a 2-foot safety factor to that. So you're going to have a total essentially fall distance of 4 feet. A Class B SRL is going to lock off fully in 54 inches, and then we add a 2-foot safety factor to that, so it comes to a total of 6.5 feet of fall distance with that one, which is much less than the 16 feet plus 2 feet needed for a traditional lanyard. Okay. I'm going to just take a moment here to see if there were any questions before I keep going. So, looks like we don't have any questions in the question box, so that's good. All right, so I'm going to keep going here. With scissor lifts, is fall protection required in a scissor lift? So if you guys, you should have access to the chat box down in the bottom right. I want to know what you think. Is fall protection required by OSHA, WISHA, or L&I in a scissor lift? If anyone's brave enough to go ahead in there and... All right, looks like nobody wants to take a stab at this one in the chat box. So a lot of times, typically the answer I get to this question is no. People say fall protection is not required in a scissor lift by law, which is not particularly true. So the law is going to consider scissor lifts a form of mobile scaffolding. Because of that, there's a little bit of a loophole. And with scissor lifts, because they're considered scaffolding, you don't have to tie off or have fall arrest as long as you have a guardrail. However, guardrails are fall protection. So it's kind of a trick question. Yes, you do need fall protection, but the guardrails are all you need. The reason why is because it classifies as mobile scaffolding and it does not have the launch potential that a boom lift would have. That being said, it is a best practice to require connection. In where I have here, some companies require connection. Most companies at this point require connection. And that is because most of the fatalities involving scissor lifts are falls due to human error, where the worker will lean outside or lean their chest over the guardrails or stand on the guardrails and they end up falling out. If they had a PFL or a lanyard on, it would have prevented that fatality or that injury. So I recommend that you have a company policy that requires fall arrest even on a scissor lift. Okay, and there's images for a scissor lift for those of you that may not be familiar with those. So guardrail systems are required in the state of Washington for unprotected edges that are 4 feet or more above a lower level in general industry. Okay, so anytime you have a platform that's more than 4 feet above the lower level, you need to have a guardrail system. The top rail should be 42 inches in height, plus or minus 3 inches. They give you that leeway, mostly in case you decide to use wire rope or cable as a guardrail, that way to account for the deflection that might be in that. Okay. They also need to be capable of withstanding a force, as I said earlier, of 200 pounds in the outward and downward direction. With the personal fall arrest systems, most lanyards do not allow more than 6 feet of free fall. That means you need to anchor it at the D-ring level of the harness or higher, except when you are in a lift. Most have exemptions for when you're in a lift. You can anchor them lower. That being said, you can buy special equipment. It's called a black label lanyard that you can anchor at foot level if that's needed for you, but you also need more clearance with those. Make sure any fall arrest equipment you're using that you inspect for damage or deterioration prior to use. Anything that is damaged needs to be removed from use right away. And all anchorage points in general industry need to be capable of supporting at least 5,000 pounds per worker, no matter what, whether it's a restraint style setup or a fall arrest style setup or for positioning. That rule just changed in 2017. There used to be lower anchorage requirements for other types of anchorage points. That being said, there is one exception here. If you hire a engineer, which is termed as a qualified person under the regulations, to come in, they can certify something for a lower number, which is 3,600 pounds, but that has to be done by an engineer, stamped and also in writing. All right, coming kind of back more away from the fall arrest and back into the slips and trips. Watch out for ice. I mentioned this earlier. Ice is one of the leading causes, especially in Washington, especially this time of year, of your slips and trips. Make sure you're filling in and patching cracks and holes, especially in your parking lots, because if your employee is injured in the parking lot coming into work, a lot of times that ends up getting covered under workers' comp as well as OSHA recordability. Repairing and eliminating raised areas due to tree roots, settling, cold weather, and ordinary wear and tear. So keep an eye on your sidewalks and your work surfaces and your parking lots for any type of damage. Make sure you reduce surface water by directing your roof drainage away from the sidewalks and parking areas, especially in the winter. If that water starts to pool up when it's above freezing and then freezes over, you just have nothing but an ice skating rink right outside your front doors. When workers are outside applying salt, so your maintenance workers may have to walk on ice in order to do that, they should spread it in front of them so that they're then walking on a grainier surface. Also, instead of walking, they should shuffle their feet to reduce the chance of slipping on the ice. Make sure that you clear those sidewalks and parking areas of snow and ice, especially since the ice can be hidden under snow and harder to see, and you could be walking on a surface where there's no ice, and then suddenly you step in an area, again, you can't see the surface, you just see the snow, and there's ice underneath it, and that's when you slip. Make sure that that's done in the morning before guests and workers start to arrive. Make sure you center and secure your parking stoppers so that they're all in a nice little line so that people aren't tripping over those. If you have a busted up curb or something like that, remove that debris and replace it right away because those are trip hazards as well. Make sure you paint or stain those parking stoppers near entrances safety yellow to improve visibility so that people aren't tripping over those either. Best practices as far as shoes and boots go, make sure your employees are monitoring the tread depth of their shoes as they wear down, especially in the fast food industry. I don't know what it is about the floor surface there. Like I said, when I was in college, I worked at a Burger King, and the bottoms of my shoes would actually just start to literally disappear and have holes in them after maybe a year of working on that surface. It's like that grease and the heat from the grease maybe just wears down those treads a lot faster. So just because you bought a slip-resistant shoe doesn't mean it's going to be slip-resistant forever. Make sure you choose the right shoe for the right environment beyond just the slip resistance. Maybe you need steel toes. Maybe you need safety toes. Okay. What costs more? You may need to convince the boss about this. Shoes and prescription eyewear are the two things that employers are not required to buy for their employees as far as PPE goes. That being said, when I worked on the pipeline, we had what was called a boot allowance. Every time we had a new hire, they were given $100 up to $100 reimbursement if they provided a receipt showing that they recently purchased a pair of boots for the job. What costs more, a slip trip fall incident or a couple bucks for each employee to go buy a new pair of shoes as needed? So you may need to convince a boss or a CFO on that, but A 30-day lost time accident is much more expensive, especially once it hits your experience period and your premiums and increases your premiums. That becomes much more expensive than spending a couple bucks on slip-resistant shoes for some workers. Okay. And then also, what protects and values your employees more? So again, I strongly encourage you to, if you have a slippery environment, to either provide shoes or provide a reimbursement for employees who purchase good shoes every couple of years for work. Valued employees are much more careful. So that is going to pay off dividends. If you're making sure your employees are taken care of and they know you're valuing them, they're going to be more careful as well. They're going to put more value into that company. That kind of ties into another webinar that we'll be doing this year, which is employee engagement. Okay. Here are some examples of boots that just have maybe are up for replacement soon, especially this pair on the left. You can see those even have uneven wear as well. So the outside of those shoes is very worn down, and that employee is at risk of slipping pretty easily. So you may require employees to purchase appropriate footwear. You may even be reimbursing them for one pair, but do you check to make sure it meets your standards? So after they go and purchase that shoe, are you making sure that it meets your standards? And also, are you checking to make sure they have not deteriorated and maybe that employee needs a new pair of slip-resistant shoes? Okay. Is it enough? Okay, we put a sign up because there was a spill. Is that enough? No, it's not. A sign's just administrative control that's only effective if it's read and respected and people avoid the area. People walk right by these signs. Okay, signs are often overlooked or ignored. It's a good start. It recognizes that you identified the hazard, but you still need to control it. After you identify the hazard and label it, whoever's responsible for cleaning that up needs to do so in a timely manner. Dry the area and remove the hazard at its source. And like I said at the beginning of this presentation, signs can also create an additional trip hazard, especially for folks who aren't paying attention and are on their phone or are looking at someone else while they're talking to them instead of looking at what's in front of them. Okay, is it enough? Maybe. So in this case, we have an extension cord going across the floor, and they put a cover over it that's designed to cover those. So is that enough? Maybe. There's still a slight trip hazard, but it is better than before. An even better solution to this would be to actually run that cord under the floor's surface so that there is no raised edge at all. However, this is great for something that can't be solved in the design phase. And it's a much cheaper solution than tearing the floor up to run the cord underneath. So maybe it is enough. Okay, so a quick summary here. Falls occur in all industry sectors. We saw that in that slide where I showed you that across all our industry groups, we're seeing losses and falls. The retail industry, this is particularly a very, very costly category for you folks in the retail industry. Falls occur in all those industry sectors, though. They result in serious injuries or death and are very costly for businesses. The standards for walking working surfaces also include requirements for housekeeping, guarding floor and wall openings and holes, as well as for industrial stairs and ladders. Make sure you're keeping walking working surfaces clean, dry, and uncluttered. Just doing that can prevent many workplace accidents. And your safety committee should be talking about slips, trips, and falls a couple times a year as well, and dispersing that information to your employees. Unsafe surfaces need to be reported and corrected as soon as they are found. That's why everybody that works at your company should have a general awareness training for slips, trips, and falls. So that if they see something that maybe is not in their purview to fix, they know who to notify. They know to call Jim in maintenance, or they know to call Sandy at the administrative desk so that she can notify the maintenance crew. Something like that. Okay. That is the last slide I have for you, but I do want to show you one document here. This document is available for download, so you should see it in the handout section on this webinar. It's called Preventing Slips and Trips. This is a toolbox talk that I put together for all industries. We have a bank of toolbox talks that we're putting together right now that we're going to be sending out to all the groups over the next year. This one in particular, though, goes hand in hand with this webinar. You can print this out and use it at a safety meeting or give it to your safety committee to go over with your employees. So go ahead and download this from the handout section. Those of you that are watching the recorded version of this, this attachment will be sent with the link to the recording as well. So check your email for this attachment, those of you viewing the recording. I would like to thank everyone who came out today. It is currently 2:50, so we have about 10 minutes left. I'll use those 10 minutes for anyone that has questions. You can type those either into the chat box or into the question box. And it looks like I have at least one question in here. I'm having trouble seeing it, though. All right. So an employee asked if cutting slits in the bottom of their shoes would increase traction. I told him no, purchase better shoes. Yes, that is the correct answer there. Do not treat them like retreading tires. Make sure that you are getting new shoes whenever your treads wear down. You don't want to make any alterations to the shoes as they came. Karen asked, can we get a copy of the PowerPoint? And can we get directions to that video? I will actually take that video. I'll find it on YouTube and I'll have that sent out with the recording. And then the PowerPoint will be available in that recording. Yes, Regina, every participant is going to get the email with the recording in it as well. So you will get that email with the handout and the recording, Regina. All right. Does anyone else have any questions? Still have 26 folks in here. All right. Well, if we have no more questions, feel free to contact me by email. So let me go ahead and I'm going to roll this back to the very first slide here so that you guys have my contact information if you need it. Feel free to send me an email if you do have any questions. That's John.Valentine at yorkrisk.com. Also, feel free to connect on LinkedIn. I share a lot of documents and articles on LinkedIn that are related to safety that would make great topics for your safety committees as well. So feel free to connect on LinkedIn. All right. Thanks again. Thank you for attending, David.